Greetings, Professor Mickey here with an advanced tip for Europa Universalis 5. We finance professors have hobbies, and one of mine is playing EU5. I'm creating a collection of advanced tips I've learned while playing this game in case you want to have a study break. But today's tip isn't actually a tip, it's instead some thoughts I've had about how either Paradox or maybe modders could make changes to forts so that they're less of a trap in EU5. Now, have a video about why forts in EU5 are bad investments. The tutorial to that is in the video description, and the basic summary is you should delete them all except maybe your capital fort. So I want to, in this video, talk about what changes you could make to that fort building to make them both worthwhile and also interesting for the player. I'm not making a mod myself. I don't really expect Paradox to watch this video. My channel is not very large, but I did put a lot of thought into this, and I think it's worth sharing. So here we go. These possible changes that I'm proposing are aimed at trying to make the decision to keep or remove your fort meaningful. So you sometimes want to remove it, sometimes don't. They try to base it on some historical grounding of why people built forts and why states didn't just delete forts everywhere, and ultimately giving us an interesting strategic decision to make on, do we put a fort in this province or do we leave the province undefended? So the core problem to fix here is that forts have two big issues on the economic side. They're very expensive, which is very realistic, and also they provide almost no economic value. Now, historically, fortifications were costly, very painfully so. You can find historians talking about how like states, towns neglect their fortifications, and then they suddenly have an army approaching, and they frantically try to repair things because it was so expensive they didn't want to pay for it until they realized it was necessary. But they did serve crucial state functions like not getting immediately occupied by an invading army. So we could just cut the costs, make forts a lot cheaper, but that doesn't stick with historical. That's not historically grounded, and it also just doesn't really make them interesting. It doesn't really do anything besides just make them less bad. So instead, I would keep the expense pretty high, but give players some real trade-offs and incentives on, do I put the fort here or not? So first change is let provinces pay part of the fort cost instead of having the state pay for everything. So this is the first big change, which is not changing the actual total cost from the fort, but it's shifting some of the fort maintenance costs away from the central government. Because if you're living down here, bordering Granada, a hostile country, the people living in this fortified province benefit from this protection. Raiders from here, bandits from their own homeland, hostile armies, general insecurity. This fort is protecting the entire province from that. So it makes sense that some portion of this local economic base would help pay for the fort. They're going to want this fort, and they would probably be willing to pay for it in exchange for maybe lower taxes or something like that to support the fortifications. So this proposal is saying we'll take a portion of that local uncontrolled economic base that we're not able to tax, or maybe it's the controlled base. That's a balanced decision, and that contributes to the fort upkeep. So this means if you have a rich province, that province can probably support a fort, and your cost is going to be lower. If you have some really poor province, that province is going to be unable to support a fort. So if you need a fort there to protect a border against a hostile country or something, you're going to have to pay for it yourself. Now, you do need to be careful about balancing this to make sure that provinces aren't going to magically provide free maintenance on all your forts. So something like maybe only up to 50% of the maintenance can be provided by the local elites would help ensure that That's again a balanced decision that is beyond the scope of these kind of big picture ideas. Secondly, give the forts a control bonus, just like the bailiff building that gives you a 20% proximity. If I build the fort is not just a bunch of walls, they were centers of military strength. You would station troops there. You would be able to project force outside the walls using that strong point as your base of operations. And so you can do things like suppress bandits, enforce state will, which is kind of what control is trying to capture. So give the forts a small proximity style bonus to the control, just like the bailiff, 20% perhaps. It gives you some small control on that actual location. And then depending on if there's good transportation between this location and neighboring ones, you'd maybe get a little bit extra control on the places that border it. This would give you a small increase in your tax revenue because you have higher control. It would, there's no way, unless it's a really, really rich province, it would ever come even close to paying for the expense of building that fort. But it would give you an incentive to put forts on wealthy provinces that need protection more than poor provinces. So ideally, these first two ideas, they would reduce the economic burden, but forts would still be pretty expensive. Actually implementing this, you'd have to do some testing to make sure the balance works. That it's still expensive, but it still is actually needed. And at least for the second idea was the control bonus. If you mothball the fort, you don't get the proximity benefit, basically, would be what my expectation on how to balance that. Now I have 3 additional proposals where I'm going to flip the logic. So instead of making forts better economically, I'm going to suggest that you also punish the absence of a fort because there is an absence of security for the pops in that province. The local pops are going to want the protection that the fort provides because they're going to feel vulnerable to invasions, to bandits, to raiding, enemy armies, and so on if you don't have that fortification blocking the occupation, providing a base for a small number of soldiers to disrupt and deal with any hostile forces. So if a province lacks a fort, well, you can just look at your individual pops and say, well, you have a satisfaction here. There's going to be a satisfaction penalty because this province doesn't have a fort. If you have a fort, there's just no penalty. So if you delete the fort, you save money, but your satisfaction goes down. Satisfaction affects control. Your maximum control is lower based on pop satisfaction. So by removing that fort, you're going to get lower tax revenue from this province because the pops are unhappy. They're not willing to pay their taxes as much. And this penalty could also change based on each province's situation. So let's say you're bordering Granada, a hostile country, very negative relations with you. Lacking security then would be really bad. Much larger penalty on satisfaction. But if you're way inside the country, you're up here in Avila, you're just surrounded by the rest of Castile. You don't need security as much. You still might want it for things like bandits, so I don't think you should have no penalty, but there's less of a need for a fort when you're so internal, or say you're only bordering allies. So that's another way we can have strategic choices here of this province borders a hostile country that I'm not going to be invading anytime soon. So I probably need to build a fort here to keep the pops from revolting and being very unhappy and not paying their taxes. Next idea, which is something that Paradox does touch on slightly. So if you reduce your fort maintenance, there's a penalty on your prestige. But we can go a lot further here. If a state is not protecting its people, does it really have legitimacy? You're not fulfilling one of the core functions of the government here, protecting them from foreign invaders. And if you're lacking security, wouldn't your country be less stable because the insecurity is breeding unrest and disorder? Now, forts do increase or reduce unrest on their location itself, but we can beef this up a little bit. So if you have a province and it doesn't have any forts at all, then I suggest you would have a negative penalty on your monthly legitimacy and your monthly stability. And have it scale based on the province's share of the total population. So, if you fail to fortify a very populous province, a very big one, the penalty will be larger. If you are not fortifying something really small like this 36,000 one, it's a much smaller penalty. So this would, again, force you to decide, okay, I need to put the fort in this big populous province because otherwise I'm going to have a big penalty on my legitimacy and stability. I can afford to ignore this poor, undeveloped province because they will penalize legitimacy and stability, but not very much. So failing to fortify your capital, for instance, would be much worse, and you would really want to do that. And then the last one here is that actions should matter too. So right now you can just destroy forts and no one reacts. Boom, it's gone. Nothing happens. Actually dismantling the fort the pops should react to this. So if I dismantle the fort and reduce security for the pops, not only do they have just a base level of negative satisfaction now, give them a big negative drop in their satisfaction. And the game sort of already has this because there are buildings where you're not allowed to remove them unless you have a sufficiently high control. Well, when you remove the fort, it just imposes a temporary debuff on pop satisfaction. And if you build a fort and they wanted security, there's a temporary bonus. So those one-off shocks will mean that our decision to build the fort matters more. So again, we think more about it. Now, I proposed 5 potential changes here. You might not need all of these changes to make forts meaningful. Again, that's a kind of a balancing thing. But I think these are interesting and at a big picture level, good ideas on how to change forts to make them more fun to play with. And they do have grounding in history as well, because that security is something that the pops probably should be caring about. They would generally be encouraging us to build forts in strategically significant areas because they border a rival hostile country, or in wealthy or vulnerable areas. They would discourage forts in low value areas and safe areas, which is probably how things sort of went historically. Very big picture there. They also make fort maintenance an actual decision, not just a mindless delete everything, because sometimes we really do want to have the fort here, even though it's not on the capital. And that would make forts no longer a trap option, because they'd be at least useful sometimes, and sometimes they're not, and therefore we have an interesting strategic decision to make on where to build that fort. Now, in an ideal world, we could make forts more impactful on the military side too, and maybe by making sieges risky or something like that. But I am a finance professor. I focused a lot on the economic side and kind of ignoring how to change things on the military side. I'd love to hear any ideas you have in the comments about making forts matter more in wars, or what you think about potential changes to forts economically to make them a more interesting part of the EU5 experience. So if you enjoyed, please comment, like, and or subscribe so others can find this video too. Perhaps Paradox will find it. And I'll see you all next time.